Hello again and welcome back. In this episode we're gonna find out how the Bilstein B4 compares to the Bilstein B8. You could also call it a B12 package. That is what is often referred to. Right now, again, Bilstein B4 with Eibach Springs, the same Eibach Springs that are used in the Bilstein B12 package. So doing this comparison here, I only had to actually buy the shocks and not the springs because I already have the springs. There and here. Free. There. Here are the old B4s, Bilstein B4, and I'm gonna be honest with you, these aren't actually B8s, they're B6s, but B6 and B8 are identical except for length. Being that I've been driving on B4s on lowering springs and haven't had any issues bottoming out, I'm gonna take the same chance on these B6s here. The valving is exactly the same as the B8. The reason I'm doing it like this is I'm always working on a budget, and these two here I got for a combined price of 80 to 90 euros. Let's see if this will work. It will. Take this one off. I like to place them in an order like, like this. Let's do a small comparison here. Now this one has obviously been in use, but looks very normal. Let's try this one. Okay, this is I know it hasn't been worked yet, but this is definitely harder to push in. Yeah, this is, whoa, this is a lot easier, honestly. Now, again, I know this hasn't been exercised yet, but I kind of already can predict that we're in for a rough ride. Oh well, let's try. Very small washer. Then this one here. The gasket. Yep. And then the new locking nut here. It says to tighten this 22 Newton meters. Honestly, I don't have that tool, so I'm gonna do it by hand. 22 Newton meters isn't a whole lot, so I think we're gonna be all right. 22 Newton meters is around there. 100 Newton meters. There. There. All right, now for the front. And here, the Bilstein B8s. Let's unpack them. Only professionals are to install it, so that rules me out. There. One thing I like about the Bilsteins is they have internal bump stops, so you don't need to worry about these guys here, so that's always a plus. Let's see. There, 80. All right, I'll throw on some wheels, tighten the top mounts here, 35 Newton meters, and then we're gonna go for a drive and see how they compare to the Bilstein B4s with the same springs. All right, this is gonna be my honest review of the Bilstein B4 versus the B8. Or as some call it, the B12 package, being that I've paired them with the Eibach Springs, but I did that both for the B4 and the B8 shocks, which means that I'm merely comparing the shocks. When I bought this car, it had AP coilovers on it. They were stiff as hell, and I wondered how well the cheapest setup I could find, how well that would fare against a more OEM style replacement. So I found some Mtech shocks, still Mtech versions, so slightly lowered. Fitted those and was initially impressed with the ride, for at least in terms of how little it cost. Then I fitted the Bilstein B4s, again with the same Eibach Springs as on the Mtech ones, and it didn't take long for me to realize that sometimes there's a reason why you pay a little bit extra, because not only was the Bilstein B4 more capable in terms of handling, it was also more comfortable as well. Then that led me to think of, what if I then bought the Bilstein B8s and did a comparison with the B4s. So that's where we are today. I've covered 1,000 kilometers in the Bilstein B8 setup, and I've covered maybe 1,000 to 1,500 kilometers in the Bilstein setup. So I feel I have driven them enough to make a small comparison. This is in no way scientific, of course, but these are just my observations really. Let's start with the pricing. Well, you can actually get the B4 and the Eibach Springs at around half the price as you can get the B12 package. You could obviously just buy the B8 shocks, front, rear, and the Eibach Springs, but that will actually make it more expensive. The next thing would be the actual install. Now, one thing I've noticed with the cheaper shocks and the Bilstein shocks and shocks in general is that once you install them, you kind of need to drive maybe 20-50 kilometers before they settle and perform as they're intended to. I don't know if it's because the B8s are a monotube design, whereas the B4s are a twin tube design, but I noticed with the Bilstein B8 that they were actually just, nothing actually changed as such. They just, out the box, they've just been riding exactly the same really. Other notes of install is that installing the Bilstein B8 is actually a little bit easier than installing the Bilstein B4s. That is because the shock body is actually shorter on the Bilstein B8s. In some instances, you need to drop the lower control arm in order to install and remove the shock from an E46. With the Bilstein B4, I could actually manage to remove the shock without dropping the front control arm. With the B8s, it's even easier because the shock body is shorter. So there's definitely more room to get it in and out and centered in the hub or the I don't know what it's called. One other thing about install that makes the Bilstein B8s a little bit easier is that you don't actually need the bump stops up front, at least. It has internal bump stops and a blue dust boot, which actually suits the yellow shock. The Bilstein B4s you need, because I lowered it with the Eibach Springs, you need E46 M3 shortened bump stop, or you could maybe take a stock bump shock and shorten it yourself. And you also need a shortened dust boot as well. And although I haven't actually bottomed out on the Bilstein B4s, I could see on the not on the bump stops but the dust boots that they had actually been down, hitting the shock itself. Other than that though, they're pretty identical in terms of install. Okay, so next up is probably the one you're looking most for if you're even considering the Bilstein B8s, and that is handling. No doubt about the Bilstein B8s actually handle better than the Bilstein B4s, but it's not much, honestly. The difference isn't as big as you would expect. One thing I noticed when riding on the B4s was that if you were nearing the limits of the car's handling on uneven surfaces and maybe the road was going slightly up and down a little as well, you'd start to feel that the car would kind of dance on you. Maybe dancing isn't the right word, but you'd definitely be able to feel that there was a lot going on, honestly. And it's not as bad as it sounds though with the dancing, because it also gave you a sense of that you were nearing the end of the shock's ability to handle, meaning that it was pretty easy to tell whether or not you were about to lose control. Like once it would start dancing on you, or at least move around a lot, you knew that you had at least gotten near the end of its handling capabilities. With the Bilstein B8s, and that's possibly the biggest difference in terms of handling, this dancing or moving around, for whatever reason, that didn't happen. Same roads, same wheels, tires, same alignment, because the ride height is exactly the same, everything being the same. The Bilstein B8s did some kind of suspension magic. Again, I don't know exactly how they did it, because the weird thing is that the Bilstein B8s are actually stiffer, they're harder. So at least my logic would tell me that if the road is somewhat uneven and there are some changes in the ride height and so on when you drive around a corner and so on, in my logic, the car would kind of bounce more, thus dance more or move around more. But they did something to the valving that isn't present on the B4, and maybe that's again something in regards to the twin tube versus monotube design. What the Bilstein B8 essentially did, or actually didn't, was that it just didn't move around. It didn't dance. at the same speed, same everything, you know, it would just stay planted, so to say. It would just handle whatever irregularities there was in the road, changes in the road and so where it would just, with some kind of suspension magic, it would just kind of even them out. That actually can be both good and bad. For instance, I'm running a pretty shitty setup of tires with some very cheap tires in the front. They were on the car when I bought the wheels, the original style 68s. The rears are somewhat decent. They're actually pretty good. They're Bridgestone Potenzas, but the front ones, something good right, and they score really bad in every review and so on. But the thing with the Bilstein B4s was that when it started dancing around and you knew that you were at the limits, you most likely also were nearing the limits of your tires. Whereas with the Bilstein B8s, because the suspension itself had higher handling capabilities, I sometimes felt the tires started to slip instead. So in that regard, in terms of handling, the Bilstein B4s were in some way actually a little bit more safe, because you'd find the suspension's limits before you'd find at least the shitty tires limits. Whereas with the Bilstein B8s, it was the tires that started to become a handling limit, at least in the front where I had the real shitty ones. Every other part of the handling was actually the same, though. For me, it boils down to that if you're pushing it and maybe the roads are just a little bit challenging, then the B8s have some ability, I don't know how, but they have some ability to cope with it better. And that's really it in terms of handling. The next thing I want to mention, which is probably something you consider, or at least take into consideration if you're considering the B4s, are that in terms of comfort, the Bilstein B4s are more comfortable. And these are, mind you, the Mtech versions of the Bilstein B4. So they're a little bit stiffer than the non-Mtech version ones, and they're a little bit lower and so on. But the comfort is better than the Bilstein B8, and I guess that's not really a shocker to anyone, that the OE style suspension is softer than the Bilstein B8s, but they are slightly more comfortable. But again, just like with the handling, the difference isn't as big as you'd think. The same goes for the comfort, really. The difference isn't as big as you'd think. The best way to put it really was that when I started driving it, the first bumps I encountered with the B8s, I immediately thought to myself, wow, this isn't actually bad at all. For some reason, I had at least myself expected a more jarring ride, so to say, a tougher ride, especially because I tried to compress them with my hands, and at least the front ones were a lot stiffer than, no, the rear ones were a lot stiffer in the B8s than the B4s. But again, in terms of comfort, there isn't really that much difference. One example is that right now I'm driving on the freeway with the Bilstein B4 versus B8s. I haven't noticed any change whatsoever, anything. But driving around town or places where there are small potholes, irregularities, changes in types of asphalt, and maybe also changes in height of the asphalt layers and so on, all those small imperfections, the Bilstein B8s tended to smooth out. Like if you go over a bump, you can, at least in this car, I can hear it going over a bump. But often with the Bilstein B4s, I wouldn't actually be able to feel it in the seat, you know. It would just be the suspension handling it, coping with it, smoothing out all these imperfections here. Whereas with the Bilstein B8s, even though they were pretty similar, the one difference there was that now, again, on the same road, same irregularities, same tire pressure, same everything, now you'd be able to feel those irregularities in the road, in the seat. But again, it's not that big of a difference really. So the next point that might be worth considering is the longevity. Now, I haven't actually installed Bilsteins on any car and kept it long enough for me to actually experience them deteriorate, but I imagine that the monotube design will stay more consistent for a longer time, whereas the Bilstein B4s will kind of degrade over time, and somewhere around 50 to 100,000 kilometers they will probably need to be changed. And again, it's just something that I think, it's not something that I've actually I'd imagine that the Bilstein B8s would last longer. And that then leads us to the conclusion. Honestly, the biggest difference between the Bilstein B4s and the Bilstein B8s, that's the price. That's honestly it, the price. Being that the Bilstein B4s with the Eibach Springs cost sometimes even less than half, and I'll throw in some links, cost around half of the Bilstein B8 setup. The biggest difference is actually just the price. Comfort wise, sure, the Bilstein B4s are slightly more comfortable, but again, it's slightly. And in terms of handling or performance, if you will, yeah, the Bilstein B8s are slightly better than the B4 in that regard, but again, it's slightly, and I've only ever experienced it when I'm getting close to the outmost edge of the car's capabilities. So I think maybe you should look at it this way. If you're merely intending to drive on the street, I personally would go with the Bilstein B4s and pair them with the Eibach Springs. Now, if I were to actually take this car on a track like autocrossing or something like that, I'd pick the B8. But I'd only do it if I actually were to also drive this car on the street. So street and track, B8. Street only, B4. Track only, not B8. There's something better than B8 if you're hitting the track. That's it for this video, really. I hope you found it somewhat interesting or helpful, maybe in terms of what suspension setup should you go for. A big thank you for watching. Hope you have a nice day. Bye.